Dear colleagues and friends, please take a seat. We have to start with a little delay, but we can not go further than this, and have to start with the first introductory panel. I am Philippe de Bruycker from Brussels University. I coordinate the Odysseus Network, and I'm really very pleased to have all of you here. Warm welcome to this conference with hopefully fruitful discussion. So the first opening session, will have four speakers. We start with our colleague Thym from Konstanz University in Germany, who will introduce the subject by making a speech about the new pact, and mainly on the basis of all the series of blog posts that we have published about the pact. One second of advertisement for that. If you want to see this series, you can go on the front page of our website, and there you will find a bundle of 300 pages with all the posts published on the pact that will later on become a book edited by Daniel. And then we will have three practitioners, Mr. Schotter, Michael Schotter from the Commission, and Mr. Ueberecken from the Council. As you can see, there is nobody on the program from the European Parliament. It's, as usual, difficult to catch a member of the European Parliament, but this being said, they have not yet an official position, because the work, the concrete work, will only start these days in the European Parliament. There is not even a draft report in most cases, so actually it's quite normal not to have somebody from the Parliament. Many of them told me also that it would be difficult for them to speak on behalf of the Assembly. And then, last but not least, we have Catherine Woollard, who is the director of ECRE, and she will also, of course, comment the pact and give us another vision. So hopefully we will then have a balanced view about what to think regarding the pact. Without going further, I give the floor to my colleague Thym, who is a privileged speaker. As an introductory speaker, he has 20 minutes to introduce the subject, and I mean 20, actually 2 times 10 minutes, because 10 minutes is the rule for most of the speakers, and we kindly ask you to respect this very strictly in order to allow other speakers to take the floor, but also to have a debate with the audience. We have people online as well. And of course, we have then all of you in this room, and we really want to engage into a discussion and to leave time for this. So don't be surprised if you have a rude chair telling you that after 10 minutes, time is over, or at least time is there to conclude your speech. Daniel, you have the floor.
Good morning, everyone. Let me start by expressing my gratitude to Philippe de Bruycker and his team for having brought us together. For many of us, it's the first physical appearance at a conference since last year, and it feels good. You have given our deliberations a title in the form of a question: the new pact, dead or alive? I'm not a fan of horror movies and will borrow from them nonetheless. As far as I'm concerned, the pact resembles a creature from the Twilight Zone, the realm of shade in between death and life. The pact is half dead, so to say, and I shall explain why towards the end of my comments. They will proceed in 4 steps. Firstly, a biblical proverb: old wine in new skins. The Commission made quite an effort to publicize the novelty factor of the new pact, in line with the bold promise of President von der Leyen at last year's State of the Union address, where she said, "We will abolish Dublin." On paper, she delivered. The Commission wants to repeal the Dublin regulation and replace it with a collection of new instruments that looks like a fresh start, as the press release put it. But surprise, surprise, once you take off the wrapping paper, the status quo ante reappears. The Commission does not propose to give up the first entry criterion. States at the external borders shall remain responsible for asylum procedures. Similarly, it does not want to abolish the transfer of jurisdiction in cases of secondary movements. The situation is similar, albeit in a reverse sense, with the new screening procedure. Screening is a novelty, but the substance remains meager, besides a health check and a controversial fiction of non-entry. Beyond this, the screening proposal essentially reiterates existing obligations of the member states. There is a general lesson we can draw from the examples of Dublin and screening. If you want to evaluate the proposals, it is mandatory to look behind the curtain and to engage with the legislative detail. Their sheer complexity was one of the reasons why the special collection of blog posts, which I had the pleasure of editing for the Odysseus Network, was such a success. Most contributions received several thousand visitors. Everyone needed guidance to chart their way through the jungle, and you will find a PDF file, as Philippe mentioned, right on the Odysseus website. Complexity had a knock-on effect on the negotiations. Governments were not in a position to start negotiating right away, for the simple reason that officials needed weeks to digest and understand the proposals. Complexity rendered a quick agreement impossible to reach. Negotiations have been continuing within the Council at a technical level, and the European Parliament has appointed rapporteurs to find a compromise among the political groups. However, Parliament is the co-legislature only. Even if it agreed on a position, the Council might still fail to do so. That is precisely what happened last time around. Remember the Dublin IV regulation, which was not adopted after years of negotiations. In short, in terms of negotiations on the legislative proposal, the pact is ailing, it's more dead than alive. This brings me to my second introductory point. The law is not enough. We all know the flagrant implementation deficits in core area of asylum law. Think of insufficient reception conditions on the Greek islands, the notorious failure of the take-back procedure under the Dublin regulation, or reports about pushbacks in several member states. For our purposes, these examples illustrate that legislative reform is a necessary but ultimately insufficient condition for a functioning asylum system. We need to ensure that the law in the books is being applied in practice. It's not enough to agree on a directive in Brussels and to assume that national authorities will ensure effective implementation on the ground. Such entrenched non-compliance is a problem in itself, but it has a knock-on effect on the negotiations as well. Stakeholders lose faith in the law. ECRE, for instance, rightly worries that procedural guarantees in the amended proposal for an asylum procedures regulation are not worth the paper they are written on. In theory, it's possible to design an asylum border procedure that is reasonably fair and effective. In practice, however, procedural guarantees may get lost. We all know the dire state of many hotspots. Similarly, Mediterranean countries do not trust the Commission's political promise that border procedures, including legal remedies, shall be completed within 12 weeks in regular circumstances and 20 weeks in times of crisis, followed by the same period for return after rejection. To be sure, legislative amendments are meant to speed up procedures, as we will discuss after lunch. But for Mediterranean countries, do not trust the time limits nonetheless. They fear the emergence of many little Morias, huge camps at the external borders. Crucially, it's not only the southern member states which are concerned about non-compliance. The Visegrad countries, they also worry. They worry that return sponsorships might be mandatory relocation in disguise if third states do not take back nationals, as they rarely do. And countries like Germany or the Netherlands worry about secondary movements, which are also an expression of policy failure and non-compliance. For that reasons, negotiations take place at two levels. On the one hand, governments discuss the letter of the law, and they are concerned, on the other hand, about practices on the ground. Such two-level games renders any negotiations terribly complex. What does the pact propose to support compliance? Well, the Commission is certainly aware of the problem. The substantial increase in the Justice and Home Affairs budget over the next 7 years, which was agreed upon last autumn, can be used as an incentive to support compliance. And it may even serve as a leverage. The Commission is, for all I know, currently withholding funds from Greece until the government agrees to introduce a human rights monitoring mechanism. Moreover, the agencies receive much political attention. Frontex was given substantial new powers 2 years ago, and it is currently hiring abundant new staff to be deployed in the years to come. When it comes to EASO, the Asylum Office, there is political agreement on the contents of the Asylum Agency regulation, which would provide the agency with a solid legal basis, in addition to the funds which it will receive as well. However, adoption of the regulation is paused as a result of the so-called package approach. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Of course, the agencies will not bring about a brave new world of compliance single-handedly, but they are one of the only and best instruments we have to influence developments on the ground. Look forward to the second panel. One final thought on agencies. Note that the pact refrains from giving them autonomous decision-making power, as the German presidency had suggested in a non-paper. Frontex and Asylum Agency may support national administration, but ultimate responsibility for the outcome of individual procedures rests with domestic authorities. I'm fully aware of the constitutional and practical challenges an autonomous decision-making power would entail, not least for the court architecture. Nevertheless, the example illustrates that the pact refrains from a decisive step towards more Europe. Doing so has the side effect that the Commission can always point to the member states if something goes wrong on the ground, because it's them who bear the ultimate responsibility. My third out of 4 remarks, political stalemate. Commissioner Johansson famously predicted upon presenting the pact, I will have 0 member states saying it's a perfect proposal, but she hoped that governments might eventually say, let's work on this. So it happened. All national capitals have agreed to start negotiating, which may be a small success in itself, but the price tag weighs heavily. Respecting red lines and balancing countervailing interests significantly curtailed the room for innovation. Dublin is a case in point. Why? We all know that the Visegrad countries have made crystal clear that they will not sign up to mandatory relocation. And I've heard repeatedly that other countries, which do not receive many asylum seekers at present, hide behind Mr. Orban and others. They might be willing to compromise also on solidarity, but there is little appetite for wide-scale relocation in capitals across Europe, not only in the V4. That is why I called my introductory contribution to the blog series European Realpolitik. The Commission accepted that extensive relocation was not an option, in particular for asylum seekers with little statistical chance of receiving a positive decision. This automatically put the spotlight on the external borders. If you cannot relocate substantial numbers of asylum seekers, you must deal with them in the country of first arrival. The first entry rule was here to stay, even though it may be narrowed down somewhat, for instance, for search and rescue. The Commission was probably aware that border procedures would be extremely challenging to implement, yet she had little realistic alternatives. Note that the continuation of the first entry rule almost inevitably entailed that the transfer of jurisdiction in case of secondary movements would similarly persist. German politicians reacted angrily to this element, which fell back behind the state of play of the negotiations on the Dublin IV regulation. In short, Commissioner Johansson was right, no one was happy, and the situation has arguably become more difficult. Recent months have witnessed increasing tensions between Mediterranean and northern countries. You may have heard about the letters sent by Germany, France, and others to Greece, complaining about secondary movements of beneficiaries of international protection. Statistics show that more than 12,000 people with a Greek asylum decision have filed another asylum application in Germany this year alone, in addition to those coming from Italy. That number is higher than the one for new arrivals on the Greek island. Although numbers in terms of secondary movements are always extremely unreliable, that's why also the Eurodac regulation would be a big added value. For the negotiations, such tensions between the Mediterranean and northern countries are toxic, for the simple reason that it's those states which sustain the European asylum system at present. They bear the brunt of responsibility in terms of arrival, accommodation, and eventual integration. If northern and Mediterranean countries fall out and fail to compromise, an agreement is almost impossible. And don't forget that other member states may silently appreciate the continuation of the status quo, given that few people go there at the moment, and whether we like it or not, most governments measure their national interest at this moment in terms of receiving less people. Then again, I'm an optimist. Developments in Afghanistan are disastrous, and the behavior of the Belarusian dictator is politically scandalous. Nevertheless, these developments might possibly bring about new political momentum. Countries like Lithuania or Poland might realize that anyone can be affected by migratory movements, not only the Mediterranean and Northern Europeans. Similarly, developments in Afghanistan create a sense of urgency, although such a sense of urgency would, of course, rather support a restrictive outcome, but an outcome might be possible again. Be it as it may, my fourth and last point brings me back to the introduction. The pact is neither dead nor alive. It's a fantasy figure of half-death. As we have seen, political negotiations are ongoing, even though the prospect of agreement is slim. The odds are against adoption, so it's more dead here. Yet it's not the legislative components I refer to when saying that the pact may be half alive. I reread the 28 pages and realized that only half of them concerned the legislative proposals on which I had focused last year, for the simple reason that they were the novelty factor. The remainder of the pact, the other half of these 28 pages, concern other aspects. More powers for Frontex and interoperability of databases, Schengen evaluation on which a proposal was put forward, another one on the Borders Code will follow, measures against smuggling, the reform of the blue card and legal pathways for economic purposes, which we will discuss at the end of today, and most importantly, externalization by means of cooperation with third states. It is these other elements of the pact which are proceeding besides and independent of the asylum legislation, many of them with quite some success. Cooperation with third states is the most dynamic and controversial element of asylum policy. Let me just mention some examples. Ongoing cooperation with Morocco and Libya, negotiations with Turkey about the next generation of the deal, and the forthcoming action to support Afghans in the region. Commission proposals for the first ever activation of the visa leverage in Article 25A visa code towards Iraq, Bangladesh, and Gambia. And the substantial increase of the external relations budget with a 10% budget for migration-related projects, together with a watered-down conditionality clause in the so-called NDC, Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument. All these elements featured in the pact, more or less directly, they are alive and kicking, controversially so in many respects. It seems to me that these complementary internal and external policies are more than a simple add-on. They are not only an extra to the legislative package. Why? There are feedback loops, which I will mention by means of conclusion. The alternative is not the status quo ante. It is sometimes said that the status quo ante might be better than a bad reform. From a purely legal doctrinal perspective, that is correct. If the Asylum Procedures Directive is not amended or replaced, it remains the law in the book. Having said this, failure of legislative reform might increase the appetite for alternative policy responses. And externalization is the most obvious alternative. Disagreement on how to deal with arrivals might result in their prevention by means of cooperation with third states, as has happened over the last years. It's like the proverbial hot potato. Member states pass it around until it falls to the floor. Don't get me wrong, I do not want this to happen, but the only viable alternative to externalization is a reasonable, well-functioning asylum system, not the status quo. Finally, remember my earlier comments on the law is not enough. Failure of legislative reform might result in gradual disintegration, with member states taking European rules less and less seriously. Read the signs on the wall. Greece has got away with inappropriate reception conditions for years. We all know the debates about pushbacks in several member states. The state of emergency in Poland renders reliable reporting about the current situation complex, but it reminds me of the Greek suspension of asylum laws last year. Some, not necessarily all, but some of these measures are certainly illegal, and they continue. I fear that we would see more of this if the asylum legislation was blocked indefinitely. Political will would gradually replace the doctrinal force of the law. I personally find that extremely frustrating as a legal academic, but it's better to face unpleasant news than to ignore it. Without legislative reform, which works reasonably well in practice, the European asylum system might go down the drain. That's why I'm so grateful to Philippe for having organized this conference to allow us to critically inspect the pact from today's perspective. It may be wishful thinking, but I personally haven't given up on it yet. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, dear Daniel, for this presentation in almost 18 minutes. So you really play the game. Thank you so much for that. And well, you said that the pact is more dead than alive. Let's see what Michael Schotter from DG Home in the Commission thinks about that kind of statement. Please take the floor.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to today's event. It's indeed good to be back in a room, having a sort of real discussion rather than a virtual discussion. And this subject really requires serious, real discussion. So I don't have a lot of time. There's an awful lot to unpack from what we've just heard, but really the subject itself is by its nature an extremely complex one. And so listening just now to the intervention, I was torn between the provocation and also recognizing some serious and very important points that were being made. First of all, the provocation. I don't think it serves such a serious subject as this, where a great deal of effort is ongoing from all sides to find a way forward, to treat it in sort of subjects, headline subjects like dead or alive. The pact is very much alive. It has to be alive, and that's why I welcome very much the way you ended your intervention on a very serious point about the need to find a way forward on the legislation. I don't think it's either helpful to say things like, you know, the protection of fundamental rights is not worth the paper it's written on. We went to an awful lot of effort to listen to stakeholders, to consider carefully the legal dimension, the protection of the Charter. This is not something you compromise on. So throwaway lines like that I don't think are useful. But indeed, this is a very complex and complicated subject. And in 10 minutes, I can't hope to do it justice or respond to the various points made. But what I can say is that the recent events of the summer have really underlined, just over the summer, the need for a stable but flexible set of arrangements. The new pact is indeed much more than just the legislative proposals. It is a new pact. There are some serious new elements in it that make it very different from the proposals that were tabled in 2016. But on the other hand, we were very clear in acknowledging that there are elements that we were very explicit about carrying over. A number of proposals that were tabled that we have maintained to respect also the various prerogatives of both the European Parliament and the Council. So we tread a very careful path on various elements. And then, of course, there are a number of operational and practical dimensions that are also set out at length. And, of course, the important external dimension and the policy surrounding that. So it's important to acknowledge that the new pact is very intertwined. It's an integrated approach, it's a comprehensive approach, and yes, it's complex. And it deserves serious discussion, and you're absolutely right. It's difficult for the co-legislators in a matter of months just to sort of say, well, yes, that's fine, we agree. No, they need to consider it. They need to understand it. They need to understand the balance, because I totally agree with you. We need a reasonable and well-functioning asylum system set out in legislation. And quite frankly, the existing legislative framework, I think, has shown itself to be not up to the task. So that's why we have tabled these amendments and why it's so important that we find the compromises. And yes, compromise means that not everyone is going to be happy. But that's the nature of compromise, is nevertheless to put the proposals in an area where they can have a serious discussion between the member states, from the southern member states' perspective, from the border member states' perspective, to member states finding themselves impacted by unauthorized movements. It's a delicate balance that we have sought to achieve, indeed, to try and find the way to that reasonable, well-functioning asylum system. And that's, I'm unashamed to say, is what we've aimed to do. And yes, it is complex, but that needs a serious discussion and the time necessary. And in that regard, we have had quite some discussions in the European Parliament is getting, really into the detail. And I think in the various council working groups, there are also serious discussions on the different proposals. We have the Asylum and Migration Management Regulation. Yes, this is the core part of it, alongside the Asylum Procedures Regulation, the Screening Regulation, and of course the Crisis Regulation. And important groundwork, I think, has been carried out. But it's true, the big political discussions are still needing to be had, but it needs the time, it needs to find that way to that reasonable, well-functioning compromise. And as I mentioned, we have also some tangible results to show for it. We've made progress, pragmatically building step by step. We have got the blueprint in place, this migration blueprint for monitoring and preparedness, to understand better, to build up the trust, because trust is the component that has so much suffered over the last years, and that means you have to build up the trust between the different players concerned. So that's one component that very much goes in that direction, which is very useful, proving itself, I think, at the moment with the crisis we've had over the summer at the Belarusian border, and also with the situation in Afghanistan. Then, of course, we made a breakthrough on the blue card. This shows that we can, with time, find the compromises that we need. It takes time, but we can get there, and the blue card is an example of that. Likewise, the EU Asylum Agency. Very important, as you say, the role of the agencies. Let's not forget that in the last mandate, we made the breakthrough with the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. That needs time to roll out, but we're getting there. That's the challenge now. And now we have the EU Asylum Agency agreement. That's a very important aspect as well, because indeed the agencies have a very important role to play. You also mentioned Eurodac very rightly. It's a very much needed component, but I think that's something that we need to focus on, especially in the coming period. I think we need it. We need it to understand the situation on the ground. There are data gaps at the moment, and it's very important to know if you can't see what's going on, then you find it very difficult to make good policy decisions. Likewise, we need, and I see from the Afghanistan situation right now, resettlement is so important. And we have made a proposal, which was actually made back in 2016, but it's still on the table. We would like to see that resettlement framework regulation adopted, and we think that that's something that we can also push for. In this regard, resettlement really has to be something, and we had a very important discussion with the UNHCR and also some international partners in July. And we need to follow up on that now. The Commissioner mentioned this earlier in the week, Commissioner Johansson. So we need to have a high-level resettlement forum at the end of September to discuss this. But there are many, many aspects to the pact. There's also the intensification of our work on the external dimension. You mentioned very rightly a number of important elements there. I won't repeat them, but it's certainly a very important component. I'm very conscious of how important it is to stick to the time. As I mentioned at the beginning, I can't hope to deal with all the different elements that are part of this comprehensive approach, but I'm very, very happy to engage with any questions that come later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schotter. Yes, indeed, we will have time. You will have time to say something more during the discussion at the end of this session. Let's now turn to Mr. Ueberecken, who is one of the observers of the negotiations taking place in Council, and he will certainly give us a good hint about what is happening between member states. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Philippe, for the invitation and the introductory words. It's both difficult and easy for me to speak after Michael Schotter and Daniel Thym, especially Daniel, who, as always, I think outlined the situation very, very well. To a degree said it all, so that's the difficulty here, but it also makes it easy because I think I would agree with much of the way he outlined the sentiments and the positioning of member states within the Council. You have as a title, provocative or not, I don't know, of the conference, that the pact is dead or alive, or even for this opening session, if it is new or obsolete. So in that slightly provocative line, maybe give me a slightly provocative answer. Well, the pact is a programmatic policy document of the Commission. Full stop. You will I think not find sort of a council document that clearly says what the council as a body thinks about the pact as a document. Michael, of course, and others, and Daniel said that a lot of member states, of course, individually, government welcomed it, a good basis for negotiation, and so on and so forth. But in the end, I think one needs to keep in mind that it is the Commission's document. And it is, to a certain degree, a repackaging exercise, what I think Michael outlined, that this is nothing to be sort of ashamed of, because it actually builds on quite a number of very good elements that were before. As both previous speakers clarified, The pact covers both the external dimension and the internal dimension, because I think one does, in a number of debates and conferences, often make the mistake to reduce it to merely the legislative part of it, or I would say even worse, the question of the Dublin reform or relocation or redistribution. There is another element I think we need to keep in mind when looking at the pact, which is that even as a programmatic document, policy document, it doesn't stand alone, but I think you need to read it with a number of other Commission documents that came out afterwards, and most lately, the Commission's strategy for its communication on Schengen. And I'll come back to that point a little bit later, because I think it has to be read in conjunction. So where does the Council stand? Which also is a bit sometimes the question that we're confronted with in a lot of political debates on, does the EU actually have a migration and asylum policy? Let me start by focusing on the external dimension and maybe some of the non-legislative elements of the internal dimension. If you go up to the sort of highest level within the Council and the European Council, so European Council itself, I would invite you to go through European Council conclusions over the last years from late 2015 till today. And I think if you do an analysis of the messaging of European Council conclusions, you would actually find a lot of continuity. A lot of very consistent messaging, with maybe one set of European Council conclusions that fell a bit out of line. You will find, I think, a strong emphasis on strengthening border management, on working together with third countries, on monitoring the migratory situation, on preparedness. This is a key element of lessons learned from 2015. And on strengthening EU tools, EU solidarity tools, such as the agencies and the funding and the budget. I mean, the substantial increase for funding in migration area with the current financing cycle, both internally and externally. And I think was the European Council and the Council in particular who insisted of having a chunk of the external funding, so the so-called Indici instrument, earmarked for migration. And I do want to recall, when speaking about the European Council, that its conclusions are adopted by consensus of all its members. Hence, saying that it's only a few that would agree and so on doesn't really hold as an argument. And I would add to that also the President of the European Council is a member of the President of the European Commission is a member of the European Council. On the internal dimension and in particular the legislation, I will not dwell too much on sort of the progress, because I think Michael Schotter sort of gave the very positive elements on the work that is ongoing, and indeed it is ongoing. I think the ongoing Slovenian presidency has scheduled 12 working party days for the Asylum Working Party, for example. That is a lot for a presidency, and that is a lot for a semester. So work is ongoing, and it is indeed very, very intense. Now, when it comes to the general positioning of member states, I think I'll here rely on Daniel Thym's analysis, because I think it is very largely correct. It is correct in the fact that it is not about only the V4. I think there are a lot of member states who are happy to be silent because some others are more vocal and they can safely stay behind them. It is correct, I think, to say that around the council table there is a very large focus on the numbers of migrants and of asylum seekers that member states have to deal with. it is also not necessarily about the most vocal member states. You would find some of them in the V4, but I think you would find some of them also around the Mediterranean. But if you look at the numbers, I think some of the member states that bear the heaviest burden when it comes to actually asylum applications and all that follows from it, including integration and so on, those are countries of final destination in Western and Northern Europe. And I think if you look at sort of the heart of the matter and where compromises can eventually one day be found that could lead to a solution, it boils down very much to the need for a very frank discussion between the countries of first entry, and there are not many, and the countries of final destination. So it is not so much in a way really about all the 27, because a lot of member states are frankly not that impacted by the whole migratory problem. So it boils down to a core group of member states. We sometimes in the Council are confronted by the remark that, well, why don't you just go ahead and put it to a vote on a qualified majority? Well, let me start maybe by saying one thing. From the beginning of these negotiations, at least when it comes to the heart of the matter, so the former Dublin or the AMMR and the question of redistribution, we've never had a qualified majority in the Council within reach. So that's where we stand. And frankly, even if we would have, I personally don't see any presidency going for a razor edge qualified majority vote on an issue like this one. And I think it would be extremely unwise to try and do that, because it is a very divisive, very sensitive matter. It is not a matter that you just, excuse me the expression, force down the throat of reluctant member states. There is if you would do that, I think there would be a real risk of provoking a constitutional crisis in the Union, because if you have a significant number of member states not accepting what is voted on, you will face a crisis of implementation. It is in the end member states and member states authorities that will have to implement it. So you need to have them on board. Let me finish by two reflections. One is that one of the difficulties of the negotiation is, to a degree, the lack of incentive. And here let me go back a few decades in time to sort of the start of EU migration and asylum policy. And that is Schengen. The first rules on responsibility for handling asylum applications are to be found in the Schengen Convention. And that is very logical, because if you don't have internal borders anymore, you need to decide, well, who of the member states handles these asylum applications. And if you look at the Schengen Implementing Convention, the country of first entry rule is there. So the question is, why did some of the member states of first entry at the time accept that rule, en connaissance de cause? I mean, they knew what they were signing up to. Well, because they got something in exchange, which is a borderless Schengen area. Now we're trying now with the pact to maybe not change, but at least amend, modify that rule of responsibility of the country of first entry, whilst not changing the other parameters of the deal. So the incentive that we had 30 years ago in terms of, well, you will get in exchange access to the free market, the opening of borders, and so on and so forth, isn't there. It is not on the table. Changing a marriage contract somewhat down the road, but you don't have very much to offer as a counterpart on this. I'm saying this because I think it shows the very important link with the Schengen debate, but also shows the difficulty in the negotiation of actually finding enough elements to get enough member states on board. My last point would be about what some call the externalization of migration policy. I think for the Council or member states, this is a bit of an odd debate. It is not about externalization, if you want to call it that way, versus internal reform. Working with third countries around the EU and further afield will stay. As difficult as it is, given some of the regimes we're talking about, as difficult as it is legally, morally, it will stay. There is not one member state around the Council's table that thinks that the day we'll have an agreement on the AMMR and the APR and all the rest of it, that then we will stop working with the Libyan Coast Guard or Turkey and so on and so forth. That will stay. So trying to mount that as sort of one being the alternative of the other, I think is frankly missing a point. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Mr. Ueberecken, to explain what's happening in the Council, and we understand that negotiations are very difficult. Well, one element showing that is that Member States received from the Commission mathematic evaluations about the potential effect of the pact. Probably very interesting documents, but that have not circulated outside the Council. Well, the Commission has been very careful because the name of each addressee of that document is printed on each page. So if you disclose it, you become then the responsible person. And up to today, it worked because those documents are not circulating except in the European Parliament. Let's now turn to an external view of the pact with Catherine Woollard from ECRE, and we have always very happy to have ECRE on board because the production of ECRE is extremely qualitative, to the point that we consider that that NGO as made of academic colleagues. So, Catherine, you have the floor.
Oh, quel compliment, the NGOs considered almost as good as academics. So thank you for the invitation. I'm going to cover 3 points. The state of the negotiations, what is happening in parallel to the negotiations, which is just as important, and the potential outcome of the negotiations. Despite our approximately now 600 pages of analysis of the pact, our overall position is that the pact is not that important. The pact will neither save nor will it destroy asylum in Europe. The member states could do either through their actions. The first point, the state of the negotiations as seen from the outside, of course. The pact as a whole, as a package, as an ensemble, seems to be going nowhere fast. Despite protestations from some member states, the package approach is probably over. Mini deals will be the order of the day from now on, and the agency agreement marks that shift. So currently there seems to be an effort to salvage elements of the pact and the 2016 package. Eurodac may pass, the agreements on reception and qualifications may survive the 2018 agreements. There may also be prospects for the screening regulation, and the Commission seems particularly committed to it. There are those who argue that with safeguards it is a workable document, and Afghanistan perhaps makes it more likely. From an NGO perspective, the risk here is that the positive elements of the proposals will be removed in order to reach these deals. And this is rather what happened with the agency agreement, where we saw, for instance, the role in monitoring compliance removed as part of the deal. On the other hand, there are some proposals that probably can't be saved. Here we would suggest the APR, the RAM and the crisis regulation. And this is partly because they appear unworkable. Their complexity is mind-blowing, and I illustrate with our mapping of the APR. That's just one part of it, that's scenario 1. There's also scenario 2, which looks similar, the procedural setup that would follow. They don't tackle the acknowledged dysfunction in the system that is Dublin, and the deal they embody is not sufficient to persuade border member states. So the solidarity offered is not enough to compensate for the additional border responsibilities. From a protection perspective, some of the border containment is problematic in itself, but it may also lead to and contribute to pushbacks. Member state positions appear irreconcilable on responsibility sharing. And I refer, for instance, to the latest positioning on RAM from this week. And a mountain of law is not able to solve these political conflicts. On the other hand, the European Parliament looks far more willing to compromise, including on fundamental rights, than in regard to the 2016 package. One of the questions was, will heads of state step in? Our assessment would be probably. For both France and Germany, they know that the existence of the SEAS is better than no SEAS for them. And both of them are slightly more accepting of the critiques of Dublin than other northern neighbours where there is total intransigence on that point. They might be prepared to broker a deal which offers a little more on solidarity, or to use leverage that is not linked to asylum and migration. For Germany, that sort of engagement is likely regardless of the election results, whereas for France it probably depends on the election. From ECRE's perspective, the question is whether they would be able to force a deal that is better from a protection perspective. The better deal that we recommend is a reform of responsibility sharing rules in exchange for compliance, but this is probably not on the table. Second point, our major concern is actually what is happening in parallel to the negotiations, and this requires as much attention. First, there are elements of the pact that are being operationalised without changes in the EU's legal framework, as others have mentioned. That includes use of detention, border containment, reduction in procedural guarantees. In the external dimension, it's of course full steam ahead. The crisis blueprint looks very much like a mechanism that allows DG Home to control external affairs. The fact that DG Home, through that mechanism, is co-chairing the analysis of the EU, that is the basis of the EU's response to the crisis in Afghanistan, I think is a significant development. And then we see the multiple other elements of external operations, including by the agencies, which I think is something quite significant. Secondly, there's ever more serious lack of compliance with the ECRE. I note, for instance, our assessment of violations in Greece, which looks at the means of legal redress and concludes that the situation is beyond judicial control. Even more concerning are perhaps the legislative changes in Lithuania and Poland in response to the crisis with Belarus. And this is an extremely serious situation where now on statute we have laws that directly contravene EU asylum law, practices that do so as well, and repercussions for journalists and civil society acting in response. There appears to be either an inability or an unwillingness to respond to these issues. And the impression we have is of an EU that is powerless in the face of flagrant violation of EU law. I would say that there's also sometimes dangerous narratives that contribute to a lack of compliance. For instance, repeating that the system is broken or a reference to the pact rather than the legal framework when the issue of compliance is raised. This supports the fiction that the member states are currently operating in a legal vacuum. Nonetheless, there could be improved compliance. The situation would be worse without the SEAS, of course. I think with or without the pact, the great challenge is having functioning EU law on asylum. And perhaps the preconditions are not in place. There is significant lack of trust, lack of cooperation, and a lack of willingness to or ability to enforce. Nonetheless, as I say, there are arguments by which the effectiveness can be improved. Third point, and by way of conclusion, what will be the outcome of these negotiations? The legal framework is likely to be lightly modified by the pact. However, EU asylum law will be increasingly irrelevant because member states choose to ignore it. The role of the Luxembourg court is a key factor in constraining the lack of compliance. Strasbourg, unfortunately, will be less and less helpful. National courts will remain relevant but subject to increasing political interference. As we know, in the absence of significant legal changes, the agencies play a larger role. From a protection perspective, Frontex's role is mainly negative, unless there is a change in leadership. And EASO's role, on the other hand, is largely positive, unless there is a big expansion in this new strand of work outside the EU, or if the APR RAM is passed, or if there's a revival of the 2018 amendments that change the role of the agency. I think with or without the pact, the strategy will continue to be the prevention of arrivals, but there will be increasing and organised resistance from countries outside Europe and an increasingly negative impact on the global protection system, which ultimately will then affect Europe as well. There will be increasing numbers of people in Turkey and the Western Balkans because these are the only countries where the EU has enough leverage to buy significant cooperation, and because there will be increasing violations to prevent access. So overall, the member states probably won't succeed in blowing up the SEAS, although a number of them may continue to try to opt out of it. Whether the pact is adopted or not, the situation will remain one of partial implementation and a, to some extent, tolerated lack of compliance.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, dear Catherine. And due to the fact that all panelists really played the game of the clock, we are only 5 minutes late, and we now have the possibility to open a discussion. And in order to salute persons following this conference online, I would first ask our technical team if they got questions from people following this conference on a long-distance basis. Marco?
No, for the moment we don't have a question online.
Okay, thank you very much. So we will come back to you at the end of this discussion. Let's now see and look at people in this room regarding questions or comments. So please raise your hand and open your microphone. I see already that Emilio De Capitani wants to say something. That's one speaker, and then there is somebody else. Florian Troner, and also you? No? Achilles. Okay. Emilio, and I remind everybody to try to remain short, not to enter into another speech in order to give the floor to everybody.
Thanks, Philippe, for the invitation. I have to make just a sample remark that I take from my former experience for 13 years as Secretary of the Civil Liberties Committee in the European Parliament. I think that when things are in a stalemate, as we are now, we have to take the occasion of crisis as an opportunity to find new ways. The Afghan crisis gives us the opportunity to use Article 78, paragraph 3 of the treaty which give the possibility to the Council, on a proposal by the Commission and consulting the Parliament, of adopting measures which, according to the Court of Justice, in the ruling C 643 and 647 in 2015, make the possibility to suspend or to modify on a temporary basis the existing legislation. This was the meaning of suspending a Dublin regulation on the decision that the Council took in 2015 on a proposal by the Commission, with a very skilled proposal, but creating some obligation to the member states, and this created the problems with Slovakia and Hungary. But at least at that time, the Court of Justice, for the first time in the EU history, created the possibility to suspend or to create innovative solutions, which could be to suspend some of the Dublin regulation dealing with the first state of arrival, and secondly, Article 25 of visa regulation, which give the possibility to give humanitarian visa, not in Afghanistan, but in the countries surrounding Afghanistan, and create the possibility for humanitarian corridors. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Emilio. If I'm correct, Florian wanted to say something, please.
Yeah, thanks to all panelists for very insightful interventions. I have a question to Raoul Ueberecken. You mentioned, you gave this picture, you know, it's very difficult to change a marriage contract on the road where you have little to offer. I wanted to ask you, what kind of things are you considering to offer, or also to put pressure? There is always probably more so in the academic circles and in policy circles, to link Schengen or to create a mini Schengen for people who are complying more with asylum rules, to put pressure on states that are not willing to cooperate. Is this something on the table? Do you work on the other side of the marriage contract as well, so to speak? Thank you.
Thank you, Florian. Achilles Cordas?
Yeah, thank you, Philippe. I have a question simply for reasons of transparency. In fact, migration policy is an issue which affects the public. It's a major political issue in the Union. So I would like to know which, during the negotiations for the pact, which states are the progressive and open one, which are the restrictionists, and which are the silent. We need to say names. I want to hear them. And I also would like to know why Denmark is out of the sight. Yes, it is a specific legal regime, but still it's a member state of the Council of Europe bound by the European Convention on Human Rights. I've never heard over these years the word Denmark in our discussions. What's going on? I mean, there are cases against Greece, against Italy, against everybody, but there is a certain, is there a certain immunity for Denmark or what? Thank you.
Thank you, Achilles. Let's collect some more remarks or comments before asking the panelists to answer. Nobody?
We have a question online.
Yes, excellent.
To Professor Thym, the question from Julia Idler, who asks, what can be done to address the implementation deficit under the current framework and under a new asylum system?
Thank you very much, Marco, and to that person for asking this question. We can collect one more remark or comment, but I do not see anybody. Yes, Francesco?
Yeah, it's a question to Mr. Ueberecken. I wanted to have a little bit more details on the argument that qualified majority should not be used in asylum matters and that the EU would not be able to enforce its law against a recalcitrant member that would be put in the minority, because it seems to, let's say, put into question whether the EU is really the institution that we think it to be. So I would like to have a few more details on that, and perhaps even a comment on whether this is only valid in the field of asylum and migration, which is somehow special, or whether you would say the same thing if we were here discussing, I don't know, transport policy or standard professional regulations on the free movement or freedom of establishment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco, for that relevant question. And actually, a few days ago, discussing was with one negotiator of the Asylum Working Party. I was interested by the fact that his approach was to say that there will be a need, in order to find a way out, for a qualified majority vote. But that's, of course, the bottom-up approach, while we heard from Mr. Ueberecken that the top-down approach is to avoid such voting that could lead to a new crisis. So if nobody else wants to say something, I give the floor to the panelists, asking them once again to go straight to the point so that we can prolong this discussion. Daniel?
Yes, I have 2 points. Firstly, a general remark. It was not my intention to present the pact in our deliberations in a dark or negative light. I think Mr. Spatter was right that these binary black and white, dead and alive narratives are, of course, a bit dangerous, but I think they were appropriate here. So Philippe made a good choice for the simple reason that they focus our mind and also allow us to identify what is at stake here. Quite a lot, not only for asylum policy and the individuals involved, but also for the European project as such. It's about trust in the EU institutions, and it's about trust also in the Commission. And that is why, that's the role of the Commission. That's why the Commission was invented by Mr. Monnet and others in the first place, to start the negotiations with a truly European perspective that is meant to bend the different perspectives together. And I think as a European, I can only hope that she succeeds in preparing the ground for a compromise, because the alternative is not only quite sombre for individuals concerned, but it's also difficult for the European project. I mean, Raoul mentioned the linkage to Schengen and the like, and that's maybe what we can also hope politically, that at some point we raise above these narrow national interests in terms of asylum policy, but consider it from a more broader perspective. What does it mean for the European project, and also what does it mean for our political climate in Europe? Because this continuing dysfunctionality of asylum policy, which I think we observe at the moment, we should be honest with ourselves, it's only water on the mills of extremist parties who use it as a tool to promote their agenda. So if we want to promote a more moderate also policy generally, I think we need a functioning asylum system. And secondly, the question of implementation. I mean, that's of course a very broad question, and you can address it from 2 perspectives. The one is about capacity building. It's also about legal reform, because dysfunctional legal rules like the Dublin regulation, and it's dysfunctional in many respects, they of course support non-compliance in many ways. So I think one element of the answer is really we need legislative reform, we need capacity building, we need the agencies, we need the funds, we also need political will on the side of the member states to apply these rules. So that is one element. And then we have the more narrow legal component about law enforcement, ensuring that the law in the books is being applied in practice. And I think here we also need various components. I mean, of course, the Commission has started infringement proceedings in some cases, for instance, against Hungary, against some other countries as well. But if you look at the history of European integration, you will realize that these infringement cases were always a minority. The biggest number of court judgments domestically and also supranationally from Luxembourg, they initiated by individuals. So we really need these bottom-up activities going on, and that has to be done in the member states. That also, of course, needs stakeholders, and that's, I wrote an article 5 years ago, right in 2015 already, which in a way responded to what Francesco said, because that's maybe one of the problems in asylum policy, that unlike in the single market, it's less evident that these individual interests have also the political influence and also the capacities to bring these cases through courts, because that is how EU law is being implemented in the single market, because individuals supervise enforcement by going to domestic courts. So I think that bottom-up perspective is at least as important as the Commission. And finally, I think experience at the external borders shows us that reliance on courts is not sufficient. We also need alternative mechanisms to ensure accountability and compliance. So all these monitoring mechanisms which are discussed at the moment, I think they are essential and important, not as an alternative to courts, but as an add-on, as a complementary device, because courts alone, they also need time, they are costly. You also need to prove the facts in all these cases. So we need these additional elements as well. And it's all very complex, but I think we need these various components to make the system work, because to conclude, I think we really need a well-functioning asylum system, reasonably well-functioning. It will never be perfect, because the status quo is really not good for Europe and not good for the people concerned.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. We will have tomorrow a session about monitoring of human rights that will bring some elements that you just mentioned. Mr. Schotter?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, it's very nice to follow up on what Professor Thym has just said, because I fully agree with him. We need to find an agreement on all the different parts of the pact. It doesn't reflect well on the European Union, on such a sensitive and important area, to be in a sort of stalemate. So we must find a way through. And that's why, unashamedly, the Commission tried to find a way through. We didn't come with this, to it fresh and new. We'd had the experience of what happened with the proposals that we tabled in 2016. And it's intelligent to try and learn from experience. So, of course, we had the experience of tabling proposal and seeing the measures adopted in 2015 and 2016. They were very controversial. They were adopted. They ended up in court. We did do enforcement there. And we got rulings from the court. We took it all the way. It's one approach. But I think it was considered that this left also a mark. And the new approach, I think, was to reflect on whether that was the most appropriate way to go forward. And on that basis, we came with a way that looked for a way that would lead to something capable of being adopted. Of course, the proposals that the Commission tables are to be discussed. They're to be negotiated with the European Parliament, with the Council. But on the other hand, we do want them to be adopted at the end of the day. And there's no fun in just making proposals that never get adopted. So we tabled proposals that we thought could be adopted. We took account, as Raoul was just mentioning, that we never came close with some of these proposals to getting a qualified majority. So we had to go a little bit back to the drawing board. But the fundamentals hadn't changed. So there were some things we couldn't compromise on. So we were looking for this way ahead. I think that there's a middle area, whether it's consensus or qualified majority, it's not really a question of forcing things, I think, to the vote. But forcing something, as Raoul was mentioning, it's not a very nice, down someone's throat is not a very stable way of building the European Union. And it will lead to you ending up in court. And that's also a difficult situation. Now, when it comes to enforcement, of course, the Commission has this role as guardian of the treaties. But it's not just a sort of, is there an infringement of law? Well, then let's go straight to court. It's a political process. Infringements, especially in this area, are highly political. And the Commission, unashamedly, in its last communication on infringements, it was very clear of the political dimension. It has a discretion to exercise. And when you have proposals that are pending on the table where you're trying to win the member states over, is not a very conducive environment, I would say, to pursue infringements all the time. So to make a sort of dichotomy between enforcements and legislation, actually everything is connected. So another reason I would say to try and be incentivized to move forward, to find the compromise. The compromise is not a dirty word. It's something in such a sensitive area that we need to take very seriously. And in that regard, I don't think it's helpful to name names, as someone said. Obviously, the member states, we know they have very different perspectives. There are lines, of course, of law which we think should not be crossed. And let's be clear about that. There's the Charter. And we take these things serious, and I can tell you that we have discussions with member states, very clear discussions with member states. But on the other hand, in terms of the finding a way forward on the pact and the legislative proposals, I don't think it's conducive to get into name calling, and it's not in line with, I think, our approach of trying to find a way forward. But you're absolutely right, it's not just about infringement proceedings, it's not just about legislation, it's also about novel mechanisms, these monitoring mechanisms. That's actually an interesting development recently. We're trying to roll them out in practical terms, linked a bit, I think, to the budgetary frameworks of assistance that we give. But also you will have seen in the screening proposal, we have this monitoring proposal in law, in the legislative framework, which is indeed a novel development, and we think a very important one to create the trust and reassurance for all concerned.
Thank you very much. Well, this is also leads us to the next panel, that will be about more EU. So we will discuss that a little bit later. What you said reminds me also that I heard from the very beginning with the implementation of the Amsterdam Treaty, the argument that you cannot at the same time negotiate with member states and go to the court for infringement procedures. So I understand that argument, but actually, if you follow it, it will never be, or very rarely be, the good moment to go to the court. But let's continue with Mr. Ueberecken, who will tell us all the secrets about the positions of member states.
Thank you very much. Let me try and go through the very interesting numerous questions. First, to Emilio De Capitani, I've taken good note of what you said, but I think the sentiment on the council's benches is let's try whatever we can do that the Afghan situation does not become a migratory crisis. I think that's I think where the council stands, and I think it has said so in very, very clear words last week. On the link with Schengen and the question of incentives and have we thought about incentives, mini Schengen and so on. It is a very legitimate question, of course, but a very difficult one to answer. And I'll start by not talking about Schengen, but by talking about the multi-annual financial framework, the MFF. When we were ahead of the MFF negotiations, there was a lot of talk in sort of the JHA migration circles of saying, well, now is the moment. We'll use the MFF as the leverage to get what was SEAS at the time adopted, to push it through and so on. If you went into, I think, any a bit broader discussions in the sense of getting out of the migration circles, I don't think that was a very, very serious consideration in any of the capitals. So I think it's a bit of an illusion to think that you can create these huge links between big files and so on, because some of them are so complicated in their own right, and don't forget that MFF is a decision by unanimity, that adding to it yet another hugely divisive political issue and trying to solve the two at the same time, I think is something so daunting that very few would really want to attempt it. On Schengen and the mini Schengen, it's true that this argument regularly resurfaces, and I do think that the perspective for some of the member states that sort of internal border controls would reappear on a more permanent basis is something they are rather afraid of because of the economic impact it could have. But then again, sort of the threat of that, you need to be sure when you issue threats how consistent you be in following through on them. In the discussion I had with the colleague, it's a bit like heading down to the south of France in the middle of August and standing in a traffic jam with your kids shouting at the back, and you telling them, if you don't shut up, I will leave you at the next petrol station. That's sort of the kind of threat this is in a bit. I don't think that it is one that member states. I mean, I think it's a very transparent one. Let's put it that way. And also, when it comes to looking at what would eventually be or could be theoretically a mini Schengen zone, I think both from a geographic perspective and an historical one, that would look very differently if you are in Paris or in Berlin. So to start with, I don't think there would be a quick agreement on that. Now the question on member states' positioning. First and to take up your words, where are the progressive and open ones and where are the restrictive ones? I would say, well, to answer that depends on which side of the debate you are, and what you consider as progressive and open and what you consider as restrictive. But that aside, I don't think it's my role to, in a forum like this, outline the individual positions of member states. Member states can speak for themselves, and all of them do so. And I think if you go through their statements, their positioning papers, and so on and so forth, you can draw very easily a map of where member states stand. Let me just say this in trying to sort of regroup them in a number of constellations or groups of member states. I think you have sort of the V4 very outspoken on when it comes to relocation. I think you have many of the Central Eastern European member states that are sort of rather on a similar line. Let's put it that way, or at least certainly very agnostic when it comes to reform in that idea. And I think the Baltics, for example, you could put in that category as well. Then you of course have the Med5, which I think have very clear positions. They have outlined it numerously. Although I think if you dig into their real interests, I think that there is a difference. Maybe with Italy and Spain on one side and the two islands and Greece on another one, because I think they are in very different positions actually, and that their interests are actually not that aligned. And then of course you have the northwestern European member states, which are the member states where most of asylum seekers in the end go to, after multiple movements throughout Europe, and they obviously have a number of interests here. On the last question about the QMV, far from me of questioning the community method. I think, as an official of the council. I wouldn't dare doing that, on the contrary. I think the argument is not about QMV not being used. I think the argument is how you use it. It's clear that we are in an area that lies under QMV. There's absolutely no doubt here. But the question is how big you want your majority to be, or how many member states do you want to outvote? For those that want to play a game, download the council's app, which is called the vote calculator, and to try and find your majorities. You would see that in some configurations where you have some of the big member states agreeing, and you see who they are in terms of size and population, you are able to outvote up to 10 member states. Now again, on an issue like this, would you really like to do that? Is that smart, with all the points that were raised by Michael and by Daniel in terms of implementing the law afterwards, the court cases you might get, and so on and so forth? And maybe it's not only about the numbers, maybe it's also about which member states are we actually talking about. Because obviously, some member states are much more impacted by migration as others. So do you want to outvote those that are heavily impacted and which will have to be at the core of the implementation of a future reform, if they openly and fundamentally disagree with such a reform? I think it's something to be reflected on very carefully. I think it's easy to say just go for QMV and then everything is solved. Now I think what would help, and I think if you look into, there's a lot of academic studies on that as well, is that the interest of QMV is not in the end adopting an instrument by QMV, but getting into a qualified majority voting logic, a dynamic that starts building. That is the interesting part, seeing that, there is the prospect of actually a qualified majority coming together, because that is, by experience, and again, there's a lot of academic literature on this, where member states' positions start to move, where they start to build coalitions, where to say, well, because they don't want to be outvoted, they don't want to be left alone, and so on, where they start to really compromise. Now, the difficulty is that we have not yet reached a point where this has really started to happen. And hence is really the difficulty in which we're in. And I think I'll be very, very open and transparent in saying that. So that is the difficulty, if getting sort of this dynamic going. Once I think we have that dynamic going, I see a prospect of reaching an agreement at some stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, Catherine.
Thank you very much. I'd just come in on some of the questions. In terms of implementation, we would agree with much of what Daniel mentioned, but question whether the pact will actually tackle the implementation gap. I'm not sure that there is a persuasive argument that says the compliance problems will be resolved should the pact be in place. And the reasons for the lack of compliance are multiple. It's not the non-existence of complex law in this area. And then secondly, of course, the pact doesn't resolve the Dublin dysfunction, which many would argue is at the heart of an unwillingness on some member states to abide by the rules. And nonetheless, our argument is really that all efforts need to be focused now on compliance, because otherwise, even if the pact were to be adopted, it wouldn't then be respected. So tackling the compliance problem now is something that is as important as the pact, not just as an alternative to it, but in order that it would have some prospect of being implemented should it be adopted. And as well as the measures available to the Commission, and many of those that fall far short of infringement are also infringement proceedings are also important. And at the working level, we do see that happening. So, for instance, in the work of the Asylum unit and so on, I think, though, if you look at the division of resources within DG Home, it does reflect the fact that the priority is focused on reinforcing borders and limiting numbers rather than on tackling the well-documented implementation gaps. Similarly with the agencies, of course, have a key role to play. And we would argue for their involvement, again, so long as that involvement is based on making asylum function in Europe rather than also contributing to a prevention of access agenda. In terms, I would say in reality, and speaking from the perspective of managing the AIDA database where we analyse what's actually happening in asylum systems, but also active across all EU member states in terms of trying to make asylum function, we do rely far too much on the courts, and that is far from flawless, particularly with the current direction of Strasbourg. So there are the steps before that need to be sort of emphasised in order to tackle the compliance issue. In terms of the member states and the accusation that came that nobody is saying enough about Denmark, we have said plenty about Denmark to the point that we're kind of sick of talking about Denmark. But it's difficult to list, to do a top 5 of the worst, most offending member states. I mean, how do you limit it to 5? And I think that the countries that I emphasised in my comments being Greece and the current situation in Lithuania and Poland and probably also Latvia, we haven't yet produced our analysis of the legislative changes there. I think is a particularly alarming situation because we're seeing put onto statute policies that directly contravene EU asylum law. So the, of course, ongoing constant flagrant violations is problematic. And we argue always for action, but we also understand the politics that mean action against Greece is unlikely, hence a description of that as a situation beyond judicial control. On the other hand, where something is put onto statute, it's very hard to justify not taking an infringement proceeding, for instance. In terms of the member state dynamics and in the negotiations, it appears that the sort of East-West conflict on solidarity is not as acute as during the 2016 negotiations, and partly because the QMV issue is further discussed. The problem on that side is, of course, that Denmark and Austria join that grouping, and it's no longer V4 but a wider group. The North-South conflict appears as deep as ever, but there we would note that we're talking about the Med 5 rather than the Southern 7, which was the case before, and our analysis is that Greece may be persuadable, even though we're often shouted down for saying that, but I would suspect the Greek government would accept things knowing that it simply won't respect whatever laws are passed afterwards. So I think the dynamic has changed slightly. Italy and Spain remain the bulk of the resistance as far as we can see, and hence the discussion, the point about heads of state intervening. Is there a deal to be brokered led by France and Germany with those countries, particularly if other forms of leverage come into play, or is that solidarity piece, is the conflict insurmountable, which would tend to be our assessment of it, meaning that as a final point, externalization remains the focus because it's the thing that everybody agrees on. And as Raoul said, to be realistic, it will always be there whether or not asylum is functioning within Europe. I think the argument is that there needs to be a better balance, at very least, with some attention on having better functioning and better protection within Europe. And the Afghanistan crisis is a case in point. Protection in the region, the wish of so many, which will of course come true because 90% of protection will continue to be in the region as it has been for Afghan displacement for decades. But nonetheless, a small proportion of people will seek protection in Europe. if they don't have access to protection, it's far less likely that the countries in the region are willing to play this role of hosting. And I think the limitations on the externalization approach will come from other countries, which are not just passive recipients of Europe's agenda. We see increasing organized resistance, and also resistance that altogether these different dynamics significantly risk undermining the global protection system and stimulating other secondary displacement crises, which ultimately have an impact on Europe. So I think there's arguments to be made there from pragmatism as well as principle about not simply relying on everybody else.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Well, it's time to conclude this session. We are almost 15 minutes late, but we had foreseen a long coffee break of 30 minutes, so we can shorten that up to 15 minutes, and I kindly ask all of you to come back here in the room at 11 o'clock for the next panel. Thanks to all the panelists. I think that we had an interesting and fruitful discussions, allowing us to better understand what is at stake. So really, thanks a lot again to all of you.